The trap is no longer hidden. It is out in the open, tightening with every threat, every deadline, and every failed show of force. What began as pressure has turned into a crisis of credibility. And at the center of it stands a White House facing a question it may no longer control. The argument laid out here is stark. If President Trump cannot accept that this is a conflict he cannot decisively win, then only two paths remain. He either makes concessions and searches for an exit, or he continues to drag the confrontation forward month after month with more strikes that may create more destruction without solving the underlying problem. That, according to this view, is the core dilemma. More attacks may be launched, but more attacks may still leave Washington trapped in the same strategic position. If military action fails to produce submission, then military action only deepens the cost of failure. From that premise comes an even more severe political conclusion. If the president refuses to recognize the limits of force, then pressure inside the United States could eventually shift from changing the policy to changing the president. In this telling, the war becomes not only a regional crisis, but a domestic political test of legitimacy. A central complaint runs through the entire discussion. The American public, it is argued, was never genuinely consulted. No broad national case was made, no clear presidential appeal was presented, and no direct democratic mandate was sought for war with Iran. That absence matters because the reasoning behind the conflict remains deeply contested. The case, as described here, was never openly framed as a war fought because Israel opposed Iran's nuclear ambitions, its ballistic missile arsenal, and its regional partnerships. Had that case been stated plainly to the public, the argument goes, many Americans would have asked why the United States was entering another war on those terms. Congress, in this analysis, offered no real restraint. The suggestion is that institutional checks failed because political pressure in Washington was already aligned with escalation. In that environment, formal approval became less important than informal influence. Another explanation sometimes offered in Washington is also rejected here. The claim that confrontation with Iran could somehow weaken China by disrupting Gulf trade is described as strategically reckless. The reasoning is simple. If such a plan escalates far enough, it risks opening the door to a wider confrontation with a far stronger power. The comparison is blunt. Victories over weaker states, whether in Iraq, Afghanistan, or Libya, are described as irrelevant when measured against a major power like China. A continental-scale state with industrial depth, strategic resilience, and long-term endurance is not viewed in the same category. That is why the idea of harming China through Gulf disruption is treated as illusion rather than strategy. Even if some in Washington see it as an indirect benefit, the cost would be severe. China's control over critical supply chains, including rare earths essential for defense production and advanced industry, creates vulnerabilities that cannot be dismissed. The warning is clear. Any assumption that the United States can use regional war to pressure China without inviting larger consequences rests on weak foundations. And if China is more resilient than Iran, then this approach risks multiplying danger rather than creating leverage. At the same time, the earlier era of confident talk about American control over trade routes is portrayed as already over. That ship, in this telling, has sailed. The immediate objective is no longer dominance, but avoiding a humiliating defeat. Even that objective may now be difficult to secure. The claim here is that Iran is not inclined to grant Washington even a face-saving escape unless its own strategic conditions are met. That is what makes the confrontation so unstable. There is also a question about Tehran itself. Are there forces within the Iranian system, especially within the Revolutionary Guard, that no longer want de-escalation and instead want the United States pulled deeper into the conflict? The possibility is acknowledged, but not treated as the defining purpose of the Iranian state. The broader assessment is more restrained. Iran, it is argued, would likely prefer the war to end, but only on terms that address what it sees as the central problem, the continued presence of United States military bases across the region. And from Tehran's perspective, those bases are not abstract symbols. They are launch platforms, surveillance nodes, and permanent instruments of pressure. That position was reinforced by recent Iranian statements emphasizing that American bases should no longer remain in the region. The response from this analysis goes further. It is not only that Iran wants them gone, it is that the bases themselves may no longer be militarily useful in the way Washington still imagines. The reason given is technological vulnerability. Fixed installations, especially those in predictable locations, are seen as increasingly exposed to precision-guided attacks supported by space-based surveillance and persistent targeting. In that environment, static power becomes fragile power. This leads to a deeper criticism of American strategic thinking. The force structure, according to this view, remains trapped in assumptions inherited from the mid-20th century. Officers still speak in the language of island chains, forward positioning, and territorial control, while the battlefield has changed underneath them. The example offered is stark. If forces sit on a small island within range of a capable opponent, they may simply be inviting devastation. Guam, in a war against China, is invoked as a symbol of this problem, with the implication that it could become vulnerable within minutes rather than serving as a secure bastion. The broader lesson stretches beyond Iran. What Tehran has learned to do under pressure, other middleweight powers may eventually replicate. Precision strike capability, denial tactics, and strategic patience are no longer the monopoly of the strongest states. That is why this conflict is described as a precedent with global implications. Other governments are watching closely. They are studying not only the weapons used, but the political result. What happens when a state under sustained pressure refuses to capitulate and instead imposes costs on a superior military power? A new element then enters the picture. Reports emerged that Central Command had requested deployment of the Army's Dark Eagle hypersonic missile to the Middle East for possible use against Iran. The system, officially known as the Long-Range Hypersonic Weapon, is described as designed for high-value, time-sensitive targets, including hardened and deeply buried facilities. The response to that report is cautious. The basic public claims about the weapon are acknowledged, but the certainty surrounding its real battlefield performance is questioned. Until such systems are used under combat conditions, their actual effect remains unknown. Historical perspective is brought in to frame the skepticism. In the opening stages of the Russia-Ukraine war, many weapons on both sides failed to perform as expected. Technical promise did not always translate into operational success. From that comes a larger analogy. The search for a hypersonic answer is compared to a late war search for miracle weapons. In the final year of the Second World War, Adolf Hitler also reached for systems that seemed capable of reversing strategic collapse, but came too late to alter the outcome. The message is not that advanced weapons are meaningless. It is that timing, production capacity, and strategic context matter more than slogans. A weapon can be impressive and still fail to rescue a failing campaign. That raises the practical questions Washington would have to answer. How many such missiles can be fired? How many can be produced in a short period? What level of intensity can be sustained? Without convincing answers, technological escalation risks becoming theater rather than solution. And even if the strikes are tactically successful, another political obstacle remains. Why would Iran trust any negotiation conducted by an administration that, in this account, has repeatedly damaged confidence in American commitments? The issue is not only force, it is credibility. To explain that point, the discussion turns to arms control history, the collapse of previous agreements, especially those that once reduced dangerous categories of missiles, is presented as evidence that long-term arrangements have been discarded too casually. With those regimes gone, transparency shrinks and uncertainty grows. That uncertainty cuts both ways. States know less about what their opponents truly possess, and they trust less in formal restraints. In such a climate, negotiation becomes harder, not easier. For Tehran, the logic may therefore be simple. If the best available outcome is American disengagement, then waiting out pressure may seem wiser than signing promises that could later be ignored. From that perspective, endurance itself becomes strategy. Meanwhile, rhetoric from Iran continues to harden. A naval commander signals that something deeply feared may soon be revealed, close to the adversary's doorstep. Another senior official warns that a naval blockade will not be tolerated, and that if it continues, Iran will respond. At the same time, reports describe a range of military options under discussion in Washington. These include short but powerful strikes on Iranian infrastructure, a ground operation to seize part of the Strait of Hormuz, and even a special forces mission targeting Iranian uranium. In other words, the full menu of escalation remains on the table. Iran's stated answer to that possibility is severe. If dragged back into open war, it could move against Gulf energy infrastructure, shut critical maritime choke points, and potentially damage undersea communication cables. The warning is that escalation would not stay neatly contained inside military facilities. The decisive strategic question then becomes who holds escalation dominance. In this analysis, that advantage now belongs to Iran rather than the United States. Tehran, not Washington, is seen as being in the stronger position to determine the pace and scale of the next phase. A phone call between President Putin and President Trump is interpreted through that lens. No one outside the conversation knows what was said, but the suggestion is that Moscow may have warned Washington that renewed attacks on Iran would trigger a maximal Iranian response. If this is viewed in Tehran as an existential war, then moderation cannot be assumed. That possibility changes everything. A state fighting for survival has little incentive to calibrate carefully for the comfort of its adversary. It has every incentive to use what it has. This is where Russia and China reappear, not necessarily as direct participants, but as potential guarantors. If any future arrangement is to be credible from the Iranian perspective, it may require support from major powers capable of deterring violation. Guarantees from Washington alone may no longer be sufficient. Operationally, the imbalance of distance also matters. The United States remains thousands of miles from home. Every major movement into the theater depends on long logistics lines, sustained transport, maintenance cycles, and exhausted personnel. Even carrier forces, often treated as symbols of endless reach, are not exempt from that strain. Sailors need rest, equipment wears down, prolonged deployment is not a slogan, but a grinding, physical reality. That is why the reported return of the Gerald Ford is treated as significant. It is a reminder that naval power, however formidable, is finite. Readiness must be renewed, not assumed. What remains in theater, then, is limited by material reality to carrier battle groups, supporting air assets, and a possible turn toward unproven hypersonic options do not necessarily amount to strategic advantage. They may instead reveal the narrowing range of choices from that angle. The turn toward new weapons becomes a sign of desperation rather than confidence. The question being asked inside the White House in this telling is not how to shape a stable order, but what instrument might finally force Iran to submit. The answer given here is unforgiving. None. That answer becomes even sharper once the motive for the war is reframed. If the real purpose is to compel Iran to accept Israeli demands, then neither coercion nor spectacle is likely to work. There is no obvious reason for Russia China, India, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, or others to intervene on Washington's behalf, simply to rescue that objective. In fact, much of the world may be reading the crisis very differently. Far from seeing the United States as a stabilizer, many may see this as the price of long-standing arrogance and coercive behavior. That does not mean they support war. It means they may feel little urgency to save Washington from its own strategic errors. This leads to an uncomfortable observation about perception. In the United States, military action is often framed in moral terms, with American forces presumed to stand automatically on the side of order. Outside the United States, the same assumption does not always hold. For many observers abroad, the conflict is not a simple contest of good against evil. It is a struggle shaped by decades of intervention, pressure, sanctions, and unresolved regional grievances. That difference in perspective matters because it influences who is willing to mediate, who stays silent, and who quietly watches. The proposed off-ramp is straightforward in language, even if difficult in politics. Washington could announce that the crisis is harming everyone, suspend military operations, disengage from the region, reopen the Persian Gulf, and invite mediation from powers willing to help resolve differences with Iran. It would be a retreat from coercion in favor of damage control, but even that course is obstructed by domestic politics. The problem, as described here, is not only the battlefield. It is also the influence surrounding the president, especially the pressure tied to Israel and its supporters in the United States. The analysis then shifts to a newer flashpoint. President Trump announces that the United States Navy has been ordered to shoot and kill any boat laying mines in the Strait of Hormuz without hesitation. This comes amid vessel seizures by both sides and rising tension in the surrounding waters. The meaning of that order depends, once again, on perspective. From the Iranian viewpoint, there is no real negotiation taking place at all. The United States arrives not with compromise, but with demands already shaped elsewhere and presented as non-negotiable. That distinction is central to the argument. Negotiation requires give and take. Repeating another actor's red lines and calling it diplomacy does not build trust. It hardens resistance. There is also skepticism toward the language of ceasefire and pause. Publicly, an open-ended ceasefire may sound stabilizing. Privately, reports that attacks could resume within days undercut any sense of durable restraint. As for the threat against mining operations, it is interpreted less as a decisive policy than as another expression of frustration. If mines are already in the water, ordering them not to be laid does not remove them. And mine clearance is not a glamorous mission, but it is one in which weaknesses matter. The criticism here is specific. The Navy, it is argued, invested for decades in large combatants while neglecting smaller but essential capabilities such as mine warfare and mine clearing. The result is a dangerous blind spot in exactly the environment where mine threats now matter most. Even Allied help appears uncertain. British mine clearing support, once important in such scenarios, is cited as unreliable in this moment after one vessel reportedly failed to reach the Gulf. That leaves a gap between rhetoric and actual capability. Meanwhile, the tactical struggle at sea continues. Iran boards vessels that move through contested waters without satisfying its requirements. The United States boards vessels in the name of enforcing pressure on Iranian trade. Each side acts, the deadlock persists, and the waterway remains hostage to escalation. The conclusion drawn from all of this is severe. The United States has the wrong force, assigned to the wrong mission, in the wrong place, at the wrong time. And the mission most often invoked by political rhetoric and physically reopening the strait by military force may simply not be achievable. And that is where the political cost to Trump becomes impossible to ignore. He has issued repeated deadlines to Iran, extended them, threatened action, and then confronted retaliation. Each time, pressure increased. The result is an image of shrinking leverage. The danger is not only military, it is reputational. A president who speaks in maximalist terms but cannot impose outcomes becomes trapped by his own promises. Historical comparison enters again, this time with Lyndon, Baines, Johnson, and Vietnam. And the implication is that a leader can become so publicly entangled in a failing war that retreat feels impossible, even when escalation no longer makes strategic sense. The train continues moving, but it moves toward nowhere. Outside Washington, the costs are already spreading. The Gulf crisis is not confined to war rooms and press statements. It is moving into food supply, fuel access, and household economics across the global south and major Asian economies. One of the sharpest warnings concerns fertilizer. A large share of the fertilizer used by countries in the global south is linked to the Persian Gulf, and interruptions in that flow are already driving price increases. If those disruptions continue, food production will eventually suffer. India is presented as an early indicator. Fertilizer prices have reportedly surged, fuel rationing is emerging in some forms, and the downstream effect may strike kitchens long before it appears in strategic briefings. The same pressure can ripple into Japan, Korea, and beyond. This transforms the war from a distant security dispute into a daily economic burden for ordinary families. When cooking fuel becomes expensive and farm inputs disappear, strategic miscalculation becomes personal. Leaders in those countries cannot ignore that reality for long. That is why frustration with Washington may be mounting far beyond the Middle East. If the easiest way to reduce the damage is disengagement, then every day of continued escalation appears less like leadership and more like stubbornness. The humanitarian argument for withdrawal is therefore framed not as surrender, but as necessity. End the blockade, reopen the flow, step back from a crisis that is punishing civilians far from the battlefield. Yet once again, the same political barrier rises. Even if disengagement is the most rational move, it may collide with the preferences of Israel, with organized pressure inside the United States, and with Trump's own political instincts. Ego becomes a strategic variable, and that ego is described in almost theatrical terms. Deny, attack, redefine events, and present reversal as victory. Such instincts may be useful in domestic political combat, but they can become dangerous when applied to war. If the president follows those instincts, the prediction is grim. Escalation becomes the default, not because it is wise, but because backing down feels intolerable. And once escalation resumes, the conflict may pass a point where easy recovery is no longer possible. There is still, in this account, a narrow chance to limit the damage. End the military campaign now, withdraw, abandon the illusion of blockade, and search for a different framework. The economic damage in the Gulf could perhaps be repaired over time if action is taken soon, but if the conflict broadens further, that window may close. Every additional strike increases the chance of a larger regional response, a deeper energy shock, and a more enduring strategic defeat. What can still be contained today may become uncontrollable tomorrow. Even the language of blockade is challenged on practical grounds. A real maritime quarantine requires scale, persistence, and overwhelming presence. The comparison is made to the Cuban crisis, when a far larger number of ships supported enforcement against that precedent. Current resources look thin. That final point cuts through the rhetoric. A blockade cannot be declared into existence by social media posts, nor secured by a handful of overextended vessels. Power still depends on capacity, and capacity still depends on reality. And reality is the one thing this crisis keeps forcing back into view. A war launched without clear public consent, a strategy built on demands rather than negotiation, a military posture strained by distance, vulnerability, and uncertain tools, an opponent with escalation options of its own, and a global economy already beginning to feel the shock. So the unresolved question remains: will Washington recognize the limits now while an exit still exists, or continue climbing a ladder whose upper rungs are hidden in smoke? Because this may no longer be a contest over who can threaten more loudly. It may be a contest over who first accepts what the battlefield has already revealed. And if that revelation is that force cannot deliver the political outcome demanded, then the next move becomes historic, not because it proves strength, but because it defines whether this crisis ends through restraint or through ruin. So what happens next may shape far more than one presidency. It may determine whether the region steps back from the edge, or whether a failed attempt at coercion becomes the trigger for a wider and more punishing order of conflict. The choice is still there, but it may not remain there for long.